Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this panel on elevating young voices and catalyzing action. We're 6 months into the year, and we've already seen a spate of climate catastrophes with floods in Rwanda, in Haiti, wildfires raging across North America. We're faced with an economic slowdown with mass layoffs impacting young people, while studies have found that mental health has worsened among the youth, especially in the pandemic. It is the future of young people that is in peril, yet it's these very voices that are excluded from the spaces where decisions and policies are made about their future. So, on that optimistic note, how can we ensure equitable access to these governing spaces and leverage young voices for transformative change? Because as the Honorable First Lady said, an investment in these voices is an investment in prosperity and security. So I have a stellar panel here with me. I have Vidisha Mishra from the United Nations University, Seane Aljas from the Office of the President in the Philippines, Isibor Aibe from the Central Bank of Nigeria, and Chara Ben Masin, the CEO and founder of Entrojex from Algeria. So I'm gonna get the conversation going, and then we'll open the floor up to you for any questions. Vidisha, let me start with you. Emerging economies account for nearly 90% of the world's youth population. Yet, more often than not, young people from the global south are often excluded in the international narrative. What are some ways we can ensure these voices are included and provided equitable access on a world stage?
Thanks, Akanksha, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for making time for this conversation. It is day 3 of the conference, so it's great to see a full house for this important discussion. Akanksha, to answer your question, and thank you for that framing, because it can sound quite overwhelming when you put it like that. If you're a young person today, you're looking at a host of converging crises, and you have to take care of yourself and the world that is rapidly changing. We don't know whether climate change is a bigger concern or AI and however the algorithm might victimize us. So it's a lot that young people are looking at. But because that is the lived reality for so many young people today, I would say it's not a surprise then that the UNDP's climate vote, which is the biggest public survey on public opinion on climate change, found that 2 out of 3 young people do believe the climate change is a global emergency and are willing to act to stop it. So that to me is hopeful. That to me shows the young people, of course, recognize that there are all of these problems, but they're also committed to act. Your question about the narrative and how young voices from emerging economies are frequently left out of the global narrative, that's all very true. And I will say, but to kind of put it in a broader context, I will say that it is well recognized that young people are the biggest stakeholders in the future of the planet, and they should be a part of the conversation. They should have a seat at the table. There are some mechanisms that also make room for that, but I feel like the conversation has reached the point where it's not enough to have a seat at the table. It is not enough to just have your voice be heard. It's important to share power. It's important to have opportunities for co-leadership. And that is what's missing, in my opinion, at the moment. To give you an example, I will frame it within what we need to maybe stop doing and what we need to do more of. Something that perhaps we can stop doing is to focus on this almost tokenistic sort of representation, which ends up being ad hoc, and young people are often invited to high tables to be consulted or to have their opinions to have their opinions be heard by a lot of people, but they're not necessarily made a part of decision-making in any tangible or substantial way. So that's something that perhaps needs to happen more. Something, again, that we need to do more of is not just involve youth in a consultative manner, but to really engage them meaningfully at multiple levels. And meaningful engagement of youth, particularly people from the global south, what I mean by that is, to give you an example, the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there are many countries that have youth representatives in their negotiation parties, but it ends up being fairly ad hoc. The number of countries that have youth representatives in these negotiation tables is still fairly low. It's less than 20 the last time I checked, but don't hold me to that because it changes. As I said, it is ad hoc. So something that can change and that can be done more of is to institutionalize youth representation at these decision-making bodies, so that it's not at the discretion of different countries, but it is something that you have to do because, as I said, young people are the biggest stakeholders in the future of the planet. And it's, again, as I said, it's not just about making room for people at these places, but to facilitate their meaningful participation, particularly people from the Global South, because it's also a matter of resources. There are many conferences or events that happen in global north countries that effectively are not accessible to emerging voices from the global south because it is a matter of resources to get to those places. Visa regimes don't make it easy. So it is important for all of us to make an effort to make these spaces more accessible to young people. And the Kigali Global Dialogue is an example of that because there have been many young people that we've interacted with over the last few days and they've been supported to be present here. So that's very promising. I suppose that should answer your question. I have a lot more to say on the topic, but
let me get others in and then I'll come back to So, Seane, Vidisha talked about the importance of including people, including young people in decision-making, and you're in a unique position on this panel because you're helping create and implement policies that can be more reflective of the needs of the current and future generations. So let me get your thoughts. How can decision-making and policy spaces in emerging economies be made more accessible to young people?
Thank you very much for that question. And I totally agree with Vidisha here. I'd like to zero in and I'd like to add to what she said on the importance of institutionalizing the mechanisms for the voices of the youth to be heard. So to answer your question, first, we need to enhance the youth engagement and policy development and also establish youth participation. And what do I mean by this? Government should have a mechanism in their countries where youth voices can participate in the policy development processes. Let me give you an example. In my country, in the Philippines, we have the SK, we call it SK, the Sangguniang Kabataan. They are elected youth representatives at the grassroots level. And then we also have the NYC, the National Youth Commission, which gives more avenues for our youth to be able to be heard and at the same time get their policies imprinted in national policies. Now, the second one is promoting youth participation and fostering youth-led initiatives. Governments should support the youth-led initiatives by providing them with capacity-building trainings and such. And the third one would be strengthening education and civic engagement and collaboration with other youth organizations, because I do believe that in order for them to be able to share with the vision of the country where the country is steering, it is important that it should be inculcated in the curricula. So especially on civic engagement, the importance of civic engagement. So I think those are the three points that I'd like to highlight to answer your question.
That's great. So Isidro, let me bring you into this conversation because one thing I think that all youth across the world resonate with is climate change and the need for urgent climate action. And given your background, I want to get your thoughts on this because you and I just love talking about mental health. So a study by Lancet found that approximately 70% of young people are worried about climate change, and we're seeing an uptick in climate anxiety among them. So given your background as a climate change advocate as well as a well-being advocate, can you speak a bit about the mental health impact climate change is having on young people and what actions can we take to mitigate this impact?
Thank you so much for this privilege. I feel there's a correlation between mental health, gender, and climate change. So you can't separate the three of them. They are interwoven. So in addressing the mental health issue, climate change, what is it in the first place? People are being displaced, sea rise level, degradation of land. People are attached to the environment. You go there, you take it off. It affects their mental health. In fact, it brings about stress, anxiety, depression. All those things can exacerbate those stressors that will trigger your emotions and say, this is what is happening to me. I was in my country, something happened, drought, the sea rise and my environment was destroyed. So I have to move to a new place. So adaptation in another environment and people are embracing you, are accepting what you bring to the table. First of all, you might not be given any right to vote. You might have documentation issues. So that can also affect your mental state. And for us to, as individuals, as youth, we need to speak on this and address this issue on mental health. So in realizing this consensus, we need a government who are gender responsive and make policies that are gender responsive and impactful to change this ideology that mental health is there to stay and take up that stigma. You are free to speak about how you feel and detach yourself from the climate news. And don't feel it's not something you can solve in one day. So you definitely need to embrace that idea of this thing is here and the climate crisis is there to stay, and we need the government policies that are responsive, impactful in terms of women who are the ones who go out to fetch for food, water, and take care of the family. So there's much responsibility on the women because they run the home. So they are vulnerable. So if the governments are making policies, the policies should capture the women basically and also bring them to the table, and their contribution should be valuable as well, because we sweep these things under the carpet and just whitewash it and say, or greenwash it. There's what we call climate anxiety. It's an existential angst that we need to also speak on as well. So if we talk about mental health, we should look at it in the sense that it's not a head problem. It has to do with your emotions. It has to do with your stressors and what triggers it. Something has happened in your environment that you need to speak about, and you need to be heard and not just bringing in policies that are not impactful. Thank you.
So a lot of young people are taking, matters into their own hands, and we're seeing a lot of startups tackling some of the world's most pressing challenges. And the Kigali Global Dialogue has been a great catalyst for a lot of entrepreneurs, such as Shada and I, to have these conversations with our peers. And the Kigali Startup Bootcamp has been taking place on the sidelines of this conference. So, Shada, given your background in the startup ecosystem, how can we ensure that entrepreneurs and these startups that are tackling topics such as food security, climate change are set up for success, and how can we maximize impact to leverage them at a global scale?
Thanks, Akansha. Thank you. It's working now, thank you. Thanks, Akansha, and thanks everyone as well for being here. I believe, given my experience, as you mentioned, and we've been here for 3 days now, actually, with Kigali Startup Bootcamp. Amazing energy, amazing impact, amazing, I would say, really an amazing will to make the change we have already seen in the Startup Bootcamp actually already today. And that, if it is something, it's a sample of what actually the entrepreneurs can exactly do to the world problems and to the world challenges that we are facing today. When it comes to the startup ecosystem and actually really having the youth making change through the entrepreneurship path, I believe we're already there. So most of the entrepreneurs are actually, majority of them are already actually young people. And if we're talking about Africa, we're having 40 million young African getting into the job market every single day, every single year. And in that market and in that environment, if basically we are not, and the government are not able to find jobs or actually really create jobs for those 40 million young Africans every single year, then this means that they're going to go to the entrepreneurship route. I wouldn't say here that we are encouraging basically the entrepreneurship mindset from a forceful perspective, but also from a perspective that we're finding solutions and we're finding basically ways to impact the economy of the continent, all of it together. And in order to do that, they cannot do it alone. Entrepreneurs, and we have basically a very beautiful saying in Algeria, we say one hand doesn't clap. So you cannot have only one actor doing everything basically in the economy or something. So what that means entrepreneurs, society, and also the government, all of them together should actually work together in order to find solutions for that. food security, you've talked about climate problems. We are seeing a long list of entrepreneurs who are getting into the clean tech and climate tech. We in Africa, we always basically like say that we're not having the problem, we're not the ones who created the problem of climate tech, but we have to actually really do an action about it. But what I'm really hopeful about and what I'm very confident and proud of is that we are taking actions towards food security, for example, which is our problem, and we have a lot of resources in the continent to start tackling this. And for that, the governments, I'm seeing amazing work that's actually being done already by the African governments. What Her Excellency, the First Lady, was actually saying earlier is we need to look into the individual needs of basically the communities which we go through. And that is, I think, each entrepreneur is really best at, is going into the community, finding the problems there, and creating the solutions. And then the government comes in and supports basically those kind of solutions by removing barriers in policy, removing barriers in financial funds, removing barriers even actually when it comes to sometimes just the international trade and really doing business pan-African way, all of it together. I have big hopes as well in our continental, I would say, institutions. We talked about the institutions in here. The African Union and also the Youth Parliament for the African Union is doing an amazing job. We need to basically have that really integrated in a way or another with the leaders of the continents as actually they go into making decisions. I wouldn't say that the young voices are not institutionalized. They are. We're already seeing a lot of parliaments, a lot of youth parliaments. We in Algeria, we have a higher council for youth as well. And we believe, or we actually give and provide our suggestion directly to the presidency. However, when it comes to the decisions, when it comes to basically really implementations and that power, this is where we need to have youth more represented and also entrepreneurs, of course, giving that. The other point that I want to highlight in here is the power of youth in terms of the digital strategies. It's super important also when we're talking here about the change and impacting basically the economy and finding solutions for that. It's very important to have the youth involved in the digital strategies of those governments. Facebook's CEO is basically, he started when it was 25 years. I mean, we know all basically great companies of tech, they started by young people. And today in Africa and global South, all of it together, if we do not have the youth who are who are digital natives today, and who are basically the Gen Z and really the great players of technology, if we don't have them involved in that, we will be creating a certain policy, a certain environment which is not going to be suited for their kids later on, for the next generations. And hence, it's super crucial to have them as well involved in the digital strategies.
So that's a perfect segue because Vidisha, I want to bring you into this conversation. Your work looks at the intersection of gender and digitization. So how can we use digital tools to help elevate youth voices in narrative building and in agenda setting?
Thanks so much, Akanksha. And exactly as was being said right now, so youth are digital natives, and it's not even about how we can enable them to use digital platforms. It already is happening. To give you an example, the hashtag #4Climate has over 500 million views on TikTok. Now we know that there's a lot of social media activism that's happening through certain platforms, and let's be clear, all of these platforms do have their, there are issues there in terms of privacy and all of that. And there's also limitations to how much social media activism can achieve. But the fact is that YouTube is the biggest search engine platform at the moment. We know for a fact that young people get their news from TikTok, from Instagram, and from Twitter. So these social media platforms are they exist as tools that we can leverage a bit more to ensure that young people are hearing from the people that they relate to. And as I said, it already is happening. Some of the biggest climate activists have used social media platforms effectively to further their causes. Fridays for Future and the school strikes, all of that generated on social media platforms. I would just say that we have to be wary about narratives because, as I said, we do know that misinformation can be spread easily through these platforms as well. And if we're looking at a reality where most young people are getting their news from social media platforms, we also need to be careful about how these narratives can be hijacked and how misinformation spreads through these platforms. But as I said, one of the initiatives that we at UNU did over the last year during peak pandemic was an agenda setting exercise on gender and COVID-19. We know that gender is something that's being considered more and more in the context of health and sustainable development goals. But as soon as the pandemic hit, it was once again an afterthought. Gender and sex considerations were not on anyone's mind during the pandemic. So we used digital platforms, discussion boards, several virtual convenings to carry out an agenda setting exercise that engaged about 1,500 people across the globe. And we were able to at least platform and try and understand what issues are for young people in different countries through these mechanisms. So I feel like the tools are available. It really is up to us how we use it and really keep the end goal in mind.
Seane, we're seeing a lot of political leaders engage with young people online, but what do today's leaders need to know about constructively engaging with these young voices to ensure that we're catalyzing action?
That's a good question. I started very young. When I work in my government, I
Still are young.
Yes, I still am. Yeah, I started very young, and when I started, it's really hard for me to, because in my office, in the office of the president, it's not common for young people to work right away after graduation. I was just really extremely lucky, and my principal, he listens to me. He values my perspectives, and I think that's the one thing that leaders should do, to value the perspectives of the young people and for them to actively listen and respond to. And I'll go to embracing digitization and technology. I'll give you one particular example. During the pandemic in the Philippines, so our country, we're a social media heavy country, so we use a lot of social media. In fact, I think we rank #1 in Southeast Asia in our presence in social media. So back in the pandemic, when countries were still finding solutions on how to grappling solutions with grappling with the pandemic, there's this lady in our country. She just posted what she's doing during the pandemic. So what she's doing is it's like a community pantry. So she shared it in social media, and then right after she shared it, and then in my country, people followed suit, and there were a lot of community pantries in every communities already. So that highlights the power of social media and how it can influence policymakers. And because of that, the leaders, even the local leaders, were implementing the same mechanism in addressing the pandemic. And also, Mishra also mentioned this in her statement a while back, to foster meaningful collaboration. So I think it is important for our leaders to really empower the youth to speak up, and also it's also important for the governments to really invest in them and in upskilling them and providing with capacity building.
If I may just add to this, Akansha. So it's important basically that when we think about having youth being understood by the leaders or having basically really them interacting directly with them, it's also important that we put certain part of the responsibility on us as youth. I see a lot of basically youth, yes, using social media and being proactive in social media, or maybe in their own round tables and so on and so forth. And this is important. However, this is not enough if we're talking to ourselves. We need to basically also be very proactive into getting into global Kigali dialogues like these and actually interact with the government officials and give their opinion, your opinions, and actually really give some suggestions in there. In my country, in Algeria, this was very rarely happening, I would say, even before basically the higher council for youth, where the youth would be discussing their issues basically between the youth, but and then saying basically maybe the government officials are not understanding what we're saying or something. Of course, this will not happen if there is not a dialogue path that's actually really opened, and it could be opened very easily if we basically be proactive and actually have that first step in that aspect, I would say. In On Projects, for example, we organized a visit for our Minister of Startups over to Dubai, and that was not something that was in the agenda, for example. So something like that can always be happening and be done.
I also just have to be mindful of time. I want to get the audience in. If you have questions, please raise your hands and we'll get a mic over to you. But on the theme of meaningful collaborations, while we're getting the audience ready, Isabel, let me bring you into this. What do you think is the role of cooperation between civil society, the legal community, and the government in enabling effective climate action?
Thank you so much. I think the civil society have a crucial role to play here because most of the civil rights movements that we see back in the days have thrived because they had the coalition, they had the unity. So definitely you can use that as an awareness platform to share your ideas and see how these issues can be addressed. On the legal part of it, right? The lawyers have a fundamental role to play to the state itself, like in terms of regulations that have to do with climate, regulations, rules, and proofreading those agreements, those SLAs, going through those contracts, and also representing communities who are disproportionate and had issues with their climate. Then also for the government, they also need the cooperation of the government too, because if there's a coalition between the three of them, you can't be overemphasized. You need the three of them to function properly. So you can't just say only the civil society, only the lawyers. You need the government because the government are the ones who have the authority to enact those rules. And if they are not in the table, how do you enact those rules? Those rules cannot move. They won't fly because you need them to you need their willpower to make sure those rules are being adhered to. And if they don't support that idea, you're just going around the circle. It's like a vicious circle. You keep preaching climate change, you keep preaching mental well-being. Like in Nigeria, we were able to push the government to pass the Mental Well-being Act and also the Climate Act because we were in the forefront. We were trying to make sure this happens. We were holding the government accountable, and also for lawyers as well. Lawyers have a huge role to play in terms of policy building and policy shaping as well. Thank you.
While we wait for questions, I know that, Sean, you had something to say.
I just want to have a rejoinder about what she said. It is also important for us to bridge the gap between the intergenerational differences, because in policy making, the needs of the younger generations might not be what our policymakers are thinking at the moment. So I think we have to have a dialogue and understand what are the differences between, say, a millennial and a Gen Z, for instance, or the other generations, because the contents of a policy should reflect what the needs of the future generations will be. So I think that's very important.
And I think engaging with Gen Z is one of the hottest topics of our time. So I think that's a separate panel that ORF should have at some point. I know we have an audience question there. If you could please introduce yourself and what you do, and then get to your question.
Hi, I'm Shelly Kedia, and I work with the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, in New Delhi. So my question here is that yes, we've seen a very encouraging development in terms of youth mobilization, youth coming in the forefront as entrepreneurs. But a lot of these youth really are the urban elite. So what can be done to include rural youth, in these kind of processes? Thank you.
That's a really good question. Isabel, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take that. I think basically involving the youths, we also need to take it down to the grassroots. Awareness is very key. You need to raise awareness in the grassroots, involve them, and create platforms in which they could benefit from, because most of them, they might not be educated, they might not understand their rights. You need to explain their rights. If you have to transcribe to the local language for them to understand what their rights are, because firstly, if you don't know your right, how do you ask for it? So you need to expose them to that in the first place and give them the opportunity, give them that platform, set up rural community dialogues, and as well involve the chiefs in that community for them to be, depending on the environment you're from. But if it's mine, you have to go down to the chief, call for a meeting, involve those stakeholders who are in charge. If it has to do with farming, if it has to do with technology, most of them, they are on banks. If it has to do with financial inclusion and all that. But there must be something there must be a dialogue before any other thing. Thank you. Yeah.
If I may also add into this, it's interesting that you mentioned that entrepreneurship is for the elite, while actually us in the global south, it has started that it was a necessity at a time. So we see the farmers, we see basically the artisans and those who really, the craftsmanship, like, and they were entrepreneurs by necessity. And I believe the global south really is having, like, all of them related to this. So if we are in the digital era and now entrepreneurship is actually an elite thing, it's just because we chose to, and it's a perspective or perception that really the digital economy is getting into. However, it doesn't have to be so. If, as he mentioned, like, we engage with the civil society the right way, you will find that a lot of people in the rural areas are actually eager to have that kind of support in order to go into entrepreneurship as well and improve their lifestyle, improve their lives in general. So what needs to be done here is basically that we are a social entrepreneur startup studio, for example. So what we do is actually one pillar that's very important for us is training. And this training, as you mentioned, we don't do it just for the universities or something. We partner with the civil society and we go to the rural areas and make sure they are digitally upskilled to the level where they can actually have their own enterprises and they can also be in social media and be digitally mature in that aspect. So I think really, to answer your question, it's our global, or our basically, I would say, collective responsibility to make sure that entrepreneurship is getting into the rural areas as well as the elite. Everyone really need to have actually at least the freedom to take that path if they would like to.
Can I also add? And also to add to what they said, I think it's important that, I'm in the government sector, so it's important that the government should be felt, the presence of the government should be felt even to the rural areas, because it is pretty much understandable why these organizations start with the elites, because how can you expect youth to participate when all they're thinking is how to get by in every day, that they're working for them to be able to eat in a day. So I think there should be mechanisms for them to get incentivized when they participate in the policy, the decision-making process, and for them to be, for them to feel valued, their positions.
We have another question.
Thank you, panelists. I'm Elizabeth Larunia, and I work on conflict sensitivity and gender. And this is a question on the issue of the digital sphere and the intersection with gender. Obviously, exciting, amazing things being done, and absolutely want to say huge congratulations to the panel on all the work that you're doing. But I wanted to talk more about the dark side of the digital sphere, and in particular for women's rights organizations or human rights defenders, where it's becoming increasingly difficult. There's a restriction of movement. So the digital space becomes a platform where they can connect and talk to each other. Yet there is this rise of cyber stalking, harassment, bullying, where women's voices are being silenced on these platforms. I wonder, as your cohort, what solutions you might bring forward to the audience on how we can tackle this. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Vidisha. I'm looking at you for this one.
Thanks. I can start, and thank you for this question because it is very relevant. And I completely agree with you. In a world where our physical and digital identities are so intertwined, gender-based violence in all its forms it's not really, even if it's happening in the online sphere, it has very real world consequences for all of us. Unfortunately, it's not treated as such with the same amount of seriousness as violence in the physical world is. And I am also very aware of the fact that a very well-organized and almost and well-funded attack on women's rights defenders is taking place on social media as we speak. It's quite unfortunate because the digital sphere really was supposed to be the tool that would help democratize democratize certain conversations and give voices to people that don't necessarily have them. But unfortunately, it has become a sphere where there's a lot of targeted attacks specifically for people that are working on sexual and reproductive rights for women, for instance. I cannot give you solutions because there's not one solution, but I will say that there's a lot of work happening in different sectors on this topic. So for instance, UNFPA's Body Right campaign is a campaign that essentially is advocating for the fact that our bodies online and offline should have the same amount of rights. If somebody gets a rape threat online, it should be treated with the same amount of seriousness as it would be in offline contexts. It's going to take a long time to really come to a place where we would have an effective handle on how some of this can be addressed or regulated. But just to say that these conversations are very relevant and there's a lot of work happening in different sectors to address it. I'll stop there for other interventions.
I think I'll just add into this. When it comes to the solutions, I do have one solution. For me, for that, and I totally agree with you in terms of actually the increase, I think really we need to tackle the problem from its roots. And if we have more women in tech who are building those platforms, who are actually the ones who are setting the algorithms, who are being in place while this is being like whoever the interaction, how actually it's going to be like, rating more of those kind of comments or so on and so forth, we would have less of that. And I've been in the Women in Tech, and actually like I lead the Women in Tech circle like in many mentorship programs here in Africa. We've seen very, very, very less young girls getting into the STEM, and maybe they study, but they don't work. And that's basically also another issue that we're getting into. So one of the solutions should definitely be that actually we need more women to work actually on the tech sector.
And I'm being cognizant of the time. So when we think about change, we often think of it from a macro level. We think of monumental change, but as the panelists have, talked about today, change can also happen on a micro level. It can be a catalyst for young people to, bring about more action, especially climate action. And with that, thank you to the Honorable First Lady and to all of you for joining us on this panel.